Ash drifted through the narrow slits of the tower window, settling like grey snow on the velvet gown Saoirse was supposed to wear. It was a ridiculous garment, deep burgundy, heavy enough to drown a woman, and stiff with silver embroidery that scratched at the forearms. It wasn't meant for running. It wasn't meant for fighting. It was meant for standing still and looking dignified while her life was dismantled in front of a live audience. "Hold your breath, my lady." Anna's voice trembled. She was young, barely past her first shift, and she smelled sharply of sour milk and terror. Her knuckles were white as she hauled on the corset laces. Saoirse didn't hold her breath. She let her pull, feeling the whalebone dig into the flesh of her lower ribs, right where a rogue's claws had torn her open 3 winters ago. The phantom ache flared a dull throb of memory. "Tighter." Saoirse told her, her voice flat, devoid of the tremor she carried in hers. "If I have to breathe the same air as the southern delegation, I'd rather not breathe at all." Anna swallowed hard, giving the laces one final desperate tug before tying them off. She didn't laugh. Nobody laughed in this keep anymore. Saoirse stepped away from the looking glass. She didn't need to see the reflection. She knew what she looked like. Tired. 32 years old, but carrying the exhaustion of 100. Her hair, a dark, unruly mess that usually smelled of pine needles and damp earth, had been ruthlessly pulled back and pinned into a severe crown. Her skin was pale, lacking the flushed vitality of the young women who whispered in the courtyards. And her eyes, they were entirely dead. This wasn't a tragedy born of sudden betrayal. That was the worst part. If Kaelin had thrown her over for a younger woman out of lust, she could have raged. She could have shifted torn-out throats and challenged him under the moon. But you cannot fight mathematics. You cannot fight a famine. The northern packs were starving. The winter had been brutal, freezing the rivers solid and driving the game so far east they couldn't track them. Their granaries were dust. Children were dying of the cold shake. And then came Lord Harlan of the southern ridges, smelling of rich meats and unearned arrogance, offering wagons of grain herds of fat cattle and an alliance. The price was simple. His daughter. A king needs an heir. A pack needs a future. She had given Kaelin her youth, her blood on the battlefield, her strategic mind in the war room. She had given him everything except a child. 6 years of trying, 6 years of empty cradles and silent prayers to the moon, ending in the cold, hard reality of a barren womb. Saoirse walked toward the heavy oak door. The heavy skirts dragged across the stone floor with a sound like dry leaves. Deep inside her chest, beneath the whalebone and the velvet, her wolf paced. She didn't understand politics. She didn't care about the grain silos or the supply chains. She only knew that their mate was down in the great hall, preparing to bind his soul to another. She wanted to scream. She wanted to rip the wooden door off its iron hinges. She swallowed the growl building in her throat. It tasted like ash and copper. "It's time," she said to Anna, who was staring at the floor, crying silent, useless tears. "You don't have to do this, Lady Saoirse," Anna whispered, her voice cracking. "The pack, the true pack, the old guard, they won't stand for it. If you just give the word." "And then what?" Saoirse snapped sharper than she intended. She stopped with her hand on the rusted iron ring of the door, looking back at her. "We fight. We kill Harlan's men. And then next month we watch you and the other pups starve to death in the snow. No, we do this. Because I am..." Saoirse caught herself. She was about to say Luna, but that title was already slipping away, dissolving like frost on glass. Because it is what must be done. She pushed the door open. The corridor beyond was freezing, a tunnel of black stone lit by sputtering torches. The smell of burning pitch stung her nostrils. It was real. It was actually happening. She stepped over the threshold, leaving the last remnants of her private life behind. Spiral stairs are a nightmare in velvet. Each step was a calculated risk of tripping and breaking her neck, which given the circumstances wouldn't have been the worst outcome. She kept her hand pressed flat against the damp, curving wall to steady herself. The stone was freezing, leaching the warmth straight out of her palm. With every rotation downward, the noise from the great hall grew louder. It wasn't the joyful, chaotic din of a feast. It was a low, vibrating hum of hundreds of predators packed into a confined space tension rolling off them in thick, invisible waves. She could smell them. She could pick apart the scents layering the stagnant air of the keep. There was the familiar musk of their own warriors, sweat-wet wool stale ale, and the sharp tang of unease. Woven through that was the alien scent of the southerners. They smelled too clean. Lilac water, perfumed oils, rich fabrics that had never seen a day of rain. The clash of odors was nauseating. It smelled like a funeral dressed up as a wedding. At the bottom of the stairwell, two massive oak doors stood closed, guarded by Yorn and Garrett. Saoirse had known them since they were scrawny pups stealing sweet rolls from the kitchens. They had fought back to back during the border skirmishes. Garrett still had a jagged scar across his jaw from a skirmish where she had dragged him out of a ditch. As she approached, they snapped to attention, their spears hitting the stone floor with a sharp clack. But neither of them looked at her. Their eyes were fixed on the stones above her head. The avoidance hurt more than any insult could have. "Open them," she said. Her voice sounded hollow, echoing in the narrow space. Garrett hesitated. His throat worked as he swallowed. He smelled of grief and unwashed armor. For a second, she thought he was going to refuse to drop his spear and bar the way. But the conditioning of the pack is absolute. He reached out his massive hand, wrapping around the iron handle, and hauled the door open. The heat of the room hit her first, a physical wall of body temperature and firelight. Then the light blinded her for a fraction of a second. Thousands of candles dripped wax from iron chandeliers suspended from the vaulted ceiling. Silence slammed down on the hall the moment she stepped onto the runner. The low hum of voices died instantly. 300 faces turned toward her. She kept her chin level, her eyes fixed straight ahead. The aisle felt 10 miles long. On her left stood their people, the Northerners. Rough-spun tunics, scarred faces, grim expressions. Some of the women had tears tracking through the soot on their cheeks. On her right stood the Southern delegation, silks, velvets, polished silver jewelry. They looked at her with a mixture of polite curiosity and thinly veiled triumph. She didn't care about them. Her eyes locked onto the raised dais at the far end of the hall. Kalen stood there. He was dressed in the ceremonial furs of the Alpha, the massive pelt of a black bear draped over his broad shoulders, secured with heavy iron clasps. He looked like a god carved from granite, terrifying and magnificent. But looking closer, she saw the cracks. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles jumped beneath his beard. His eyes, usually a warm storm cloud grey, were flat and dark. He was staring over the heads of the crowd, looking at nothing. He refused to look at her. Coward, her wolf snarled internally. Survivor, her human mind countered. They were both just doing what they had to do. And then she saw her, standing slightly off to the side, flanked by her father's heavily armed guards. Cecily. She was devastatingly young, barely 20. Her hair was spun gold, cascading in perfect shining waves down her back. Her skin was unblemished, porcelain, smooth, untouched by frostbite or enemy claws. She wore a dress of pale ivory silk that clung to her curves, making her look like a creature of light rather than a wolf of blood and bone. She smelled like crushed white roses and summer honey. The scent was cloying, overpowering the natural smells of the room. It was the scent of a soft life. Saoirse reached the front of the dais and stopped. She didn't look up at Kaelin yet. She looked at Cecily. She met her gaze, and to her credit, she didn't flinch. There was no malice in her bright blue eyes, only a sort of nervous determination. She was a pawn, just like Saoirse, traded for cattle. She felt a sudden bitter wave of exhaustion wash over her. She wanted to take off this heavy dress. She wanted to go to the upper battlements, sit in the freezing wind, and drink a skin of sour wine until the world stopped spinning. But the elder, an ancient wolf named Bran, whose fur had gone entirely white, stepped to the center of the dais. He held a wooden bowl carved with the ancient runes of the goddess and an obsidian knife that drank the candlelight. The ceremony was beginning. There was no turning back. We gather under the unblinking eye of the moon. Bran began, his voice surprisingly robust for a man whose bones looked fragile enough to snap in a strong wind. His words echoed off the high stone arches, steeped in centuries of unchanging tradition. To witness the shifting of tides, to honor the sacrifice of the past, and to secure the survival of the future. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking directly at Saoirse. His old eyes were filled with a profound sorrow, a stark contrast to his steady, impassive voice. She took a breath. The air tasted of burning wax and damp wool. She stepped up onto the first wooden step of the dais. Her leather boots scuffed against the worn boards. She climbed the remaining 3 steps, walking until she stood precisely 2 feet away from Kaelin. Up close, the smell of him hit her. It bypassed her rational brain and struck straight at the base of her spine. Pine resin, wood smoke, and the clean, cold scent of a mountain stream. It was the smell of her home. It was the smell of her safety. Her wolf hurled herself against the cage of her ribs, howling in primal agony. Mate, ours. Fight for him. She dug her nails into her palms, welcoming the sharp pain to anchor her. She forced herself to look at Kaelin's face. He finally looked down at her. For a split second, the stoic mask shattered. She saw the raw, bleeding wound inside him. She saw the nights they had spent arguing this, the times he had broken down and sworn he would rather let the pack burn than lose her, the times she had held his face and told him he was a king before he was a husband. The shared agony passed between them in a single devastating heartbeat. Then the mask slammed back into place. His eyes went dead again. Saoirse of the Northern Pines, Bran intoned, turning to her and extending the obsidian knife handle first. Do you come before the pack of your own free will? I do, she said. Her voice was loud, carrying easily to the back of the hall. It didn't shake. She wouldn't give the Southerners the satisfaction of a broken woman. Do you acknowledge that the bond of the flesh has brought forth no fruit to inherit the mantle of the Alpha? The words were designed to be clinical, but they cut deeper than any blade. She felt the collective flinch of their pack behind her. She heard a low, threatening rumble from the direction of Jorn and Garrett. "I acknowledge it," she replied, staring a hole into the center of Kaelin's chest. Bran stepped closer. "Then, take the stone, sever the tie of blood, and step into the shadow so the pack may walk in the light." She reached out and took the knife. The obsidian was freezing slick and heavy in her hand. She held her left hand out over the carved wooden bowl. The blade was razor sharp. She didn't hesitate. She pressed the black edge against her palm and pulled. The skin parted. The pain was clean sharp. Blood welled up instantly, dark red and thick, pooling in the cup of her hand before dripping down. Plat, plat, plat. 3 drops hit the dry wood of the bowl. With each drop, she felt a physical tearing inside her chest. The mating bond, a golden humming thread that had connected her soul to Kaelin's for a decade, began to fray. It felt like someone was reaching into her lungs and pulling them inside out. She gasped, a quiet, shuddering intake of air, her vision swimming for a second. She forced her hand down to her side, letting the blood drip onto the floorboards. She dropped the knife onto the altar with a heavy clatter. Then she performed the final act. She lowered her head, staring at the toes of Kaelin's boots. She bowed. It was not a submissive cringe. She bent at the waist, a rigid, formal bow of a soldier resigning her commission. "I yield the space beside the king." She said the ancient words, tasting like rust in her mouth. She straightened up. She looked at Kaelin one last time, giving him a curt nod. Then, dragging her heavy velvet skirts, she stepped sideways. She stepped to the left, moving off the center of the dais, leaving a wide, gaping hole beside the Alpha. The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear the torches crackling. You could hear the harsh breathing of the wolves. Bran turned to the southern side of the room. "Cecily of the southern ridges, step forward and fill the void." There was a rustle of silk. Cecily moved. She walked with practiced grace, gliding across the floor, up the wooden steps. The overpowering scent of white roses flooded the dais, suffocating the smell of her blood. She came to a halt in the exact spot she had just vacated. She looked up at Kaelin, her cheeks flushed, her eyes wide, with a mixture of fear and awe. She looked perfect. A perfect, unblemished vessel. Bran turned to Kaelin. He picked up the bloody obsidian knife. "Alpha King, take the hand of your new Luna. Bleed with her and bind your lines." Kaelin stood rigid. He was supposed to reach out. He was supposed to take the knife, slice his own palm, and press it against Cecily's, sealing the political pact with a blood oath. Cecily tentatively lifted her small, delicate hand, offering it to him. Kaelin slowly raised his right arm. The heavy bear fur shifted around his shoulders. His hand hovered in the air between them. And then he stopped. His hand hung suspended inches from Cecily's fingers. He wasn't moving. His chest stopped rising and falling. The seconds stretched. 1, 2, 3. A murmur rippled through the southern delegation. Lord Harlan shifted his weight, his heavy boots scuffing impatiently against the stone. Cecily's smile faltered her hand, trembling slightly in the air. "My king," Bran whispered, confusion leaking into his ancient voice. Kaelin didn't answer the elder. His head turned agonizingly slow, like the rusty gears of a siege engine turning against the mud. He looked past Cecily. He looked past the altar. He looked at Saoirse. His nostrils flared. He was pulling in the air. The thick, cloying scent of the roses was there, yes, but beneath it, sharp and metallic, was the smell of her blood, dripping onto the floorboards. The scent of pine and rain laced with the bitter tang of severed ties. She saw his throat work. She saw the muscles in his forearms bunch and tighten until the veins stood out like cords. The dead stoic mask he had worn all evening wasn't just cracking anymore. It was shattering, blowing apart from the inside out. His eyes were no longer flat grey. The pupil had blown wide, consuming the iris, turning his eyes entirely black. The wolf was at the surface. "Kaelin," she breathed a warning so quiet only he could hear it. "Don't do this. They had sacrificed too much. Don't ruin it now." He lowered his hand. He didn't take the knife. He didn't touch Cecily. Instead, a sound ripped out of his chest. It wasn't a word. It wasn't a human sound. It was a low, vibrational snarl that started in the very center of his being and echoed out into the hall. It was a sound of absolute territorial violence. The temperature in the room plummeted. The magic of a dominant alpha losing control rushed over the crowd like a shockwave. 200 northern wolves instantly dropped into a crouch, their eyes flashing gold, answering their king's distress before they even knew what was happening. The southern guards drew their swords, the scrape of steel ringing out horribly in the tense air. Lord Harlan roared from the floor. "What is the meaning of this? Complete the rite." Kaelin ignored him. He took one step toward her entirely, ignoring the trembling girl standing in his way. Cecily shrank back, a small gasp escaping her lips as the sheer suffocating pressure of his aura hit her. He looked at her bleeding hand. Then he looked at her face. "No," Kaelin said. The word was a gravelly rasp, barely human. He turned his massive head toward Bran, then toward the stunned crowd, his black eyes blazing with a dangerous feral light. "The ceremony." The Alpha King snarled, his voice booming off the stone walls, shaking the dust from the rafters, "is over." Chaos erupted, not with a roar, but with 100 scraping sounds of steel leaving oiled scabbards. The collective intake of breath from 300 people sucked the oxygen from the great hall, leaving a vacuum of pure vibrating tension. The heavy, suffocating scent of the southern delegation's perfumed oils suddenly soured, overpowered by the sharp, acrid stench of their sudden terror. They were, after all, vastly outnumbered in a room full of apex predators. Saoirse didn't feel a sudden rush of romantic relief. She didn't swoon, and her heart didn't soar. She felt a cold, jagged spike of absolute panic drive itself through her ribs. He had ruined it. 6 months of agonizing negotiations, the bitter swallowing of her pride, the endless sleepless nights where they sat on opposite sides of the bed, convincing each other that they were doing the right thing, the physical severing of her own flesh, all of it shattered into useless fragments because the king couldn't hold his nerve. "What have you done?" she hissed. She took a step back as he advanced, but her heel caught in the heavy, ridiculous velvet of her train. She stumbled, her arms flailing for balance, feeling utterly foolish in a moment that demanded absolute gravity. Kalen caught her, his massive hand, hot and calloused, clamped around her left forearm. His fingers pressed directly against the fresh bleeding cut on her palm. The shock of his touch sent a jolt of pure, agonizing electricity straight up her arm, bypassing the nerves and striking directly at her soul. Inside her chest, the frayed, bleeding ends of their mating bond, the tie she had just tried to cut, writhed like decapitated snakes, sensing his proximity and trying desperately to stitch themselves back together. It felt like swallowing ground glass. She let out a choked, ugly gasp, her knees buckling under the sheer physical trauma of a bond trapped in limbo. "Don't touch me," she choked out, slapping her uninjured hand against his chest. Her skin was slick with a sudden freezing sweat. Kalen let go. "They will slaughter us. Harlan holds the grain." He didn't let go. He hauled her upright, pulling her flush against the heavy iron clasps of his ceremonial bear pelt. His chest was heaving, a frantic rhythmic pounding against her collarbone. When she looked up, his eyes were still a bottomless, terrifying black. He smelled of ozone-crushed pine and impending violence. The wolf was entirely at the surface, pacing behind the windows of his eyes, looking for a throat to tear. "Let them starve," Kalen growled. His voice wasn't his own. It was a dual-toned vibration that resonated in the floorboards. "Let the ice take the keep. Let the rivers freeze to the bedrock. I am not doing this." "You don't have a choice," she screamed, the polite, dead-eyed decorum of the former Luna completely burning away. She grabbed handfuls of the thick fur on his chest, her own blood smearing into the dark pelt. "We have pups eating boiled leather in the lower wards. You are their king. You are supposed to save them. You selfish bastard." Tears, hot and furious, finally spilled over her eyelashes, cutting tracks through the fine layer of ash on her cheeks. She hit him a closed-fist punch to the sternum that felt like striking a brick wall. He didn't even flinch. He just wrapped his other arm around her waist, pulling her so tightly against him that she could barely draw breath, anchoring her to him in a room that was rapidly descending into madness. "Treason!" Lord Harlan's voice sliced through the heavy air, shrill and shaking with outrage. The Southern Lord had abandoned his seat, his face mottled purple, with rage spit flying from his lips to land on the stone floor. He pointed a trembling ring-heavy finger at the dais. "You break a sworn blood-pact Northman. You spit on the mercy of the southern ridges." Harlan signaled his captain, a tall, whip-thin man with cruel eyes and polished silver armor. "Take Cecily back. We leave, and we burn the grain wagons in the courtyard on our way out. Let these feral beasts eat their pride." A low, collective snarl rose from the left side of the hall. The northern pack, her people. They were starving, exhausted, and broken, but the threat of burning food in front of a hungry wolf is a fast track to a massacre. Several of their warriors dropped to their hands and knees, the sound of bones popping and cracking echoing through the vaulted ceiling as they began the painful rapid shift into their wolf forms. "Hold!" she yelled, tearing her face away from Kalen's chest. She aimed her voice at their people, lacing it with every ounce of lunar command she still possessed. It was a gamble. Technically, she had yielded the space, but habits bred over a decade die hard. The shifting wolves froze, caught halfway between man and beast, their eyes glowing gold in the candlelight looking to her for confirmation. She turned her attention back to the Southern Lord. Lord Harlan. She started trying to inject reason into a room that smelled entirely of blood and testosterone. Your mate is a dead man. Harlan spat, cutting her off. The mask of the benevolent savior had completely melted away, revealing the petty, opportunistic tyrant beneath. The treaty is void. The grain is ours, and by morning your pack will be nothing but a footnote in the snow. Beside her, Kaelin let out a laugh. It was a dark, hollow sound, devoid of any humor, scraping against the stone walls like a rusty blade. He slowly released her waist, though he kept a bruising grip on her uninjured hand. He took a single, deliberate step forward, placing himself slightly in front of her, shielding her body with his own. The Alpha King had finally found his voice. "No one," Kaelin said softly, the quiet menace in his tone far more terrifying than a shout, "burns anything on my land." The heat in the great hall was becoming unbearable. The hundreds of candles overhead seemed to burn hotter, the wax dripping, rapidly splashing onto the stone floor like pale blood. The air was a stagnant, suffocating soup of unwashed bodies' fear and the cloying remnants of Cecily's floral perfume. Cecily herself had collapsed onto the wooden steps of the dais, weeping silently into her hands, completely forgotten by her father. She looked incredibly small, a bird trapped in a cage full of starving hounds. "Your land," Harlan sneered, emboldened by the ring of drawn steel surrounding him. "Your land is a graveyard, Kaelin. You rule over ghosts and beggars. You needed me to survive. We needed food." Kaelin corrected his posture, completely relaxed, a dangerous stillness settling over him. It was the stance of a fighter who had already calculated the exact angle needed to snap a neck. "We did not need a master." Saoirse wasn't looking at Harlan. She had learned a long time ago that one doesn't watch the loudest man in the room. They watch the quiet ones. Her eyes scanned the southern delegation. The nobles in their velvets were cowering, but the soldiers, the heavily armed men who had escorted the grain wagons, were moving with precise, coordinated intent. They weren't forming a defensive ring around Lord Harlan. They were fanning out. She watched the captain, the whip-thin man with the silver armor. He wasn't looking at Kaelin. He was looking at the back of the hall. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. Her gaze snapped to the main entrance. The two massive oak doors. Bjorn and Garrett, their guards, were no longer standing at attention. Garrett was slumped against the damp stone wall, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his rough-spun tunic. Bjorn was on his knees, coughing violently, a thick stream of blood running down his chin. 3 southern guards stood over them, sliding a massive iron bar across the door handles, sealing them inside. They had locked the doors. A cold clarity washed over her, instantly burning away the lingering pain of the severed bond. This wasn't a botched wedding. It was a slaughterhouse. She flared her nostrils, pushing past the overwhelming smells of sweat and perfume, forcing her wolf to dissect the air. She dug deeper into the scent profile of the southern guards. Beneath the leather and the polished steel, there was something else, something bitter, astringent. It smelled like damp earth and crushed rotting autumn leaves. It was a scent every northern wolf was taught to fear before they could even walk. Wolfsbane. They had coated their blades. Even a shallow cut would introduce the neurotoxin into their bloodstream, paralyzing the shifting reflex and slowing their healing down to human speeds. Harlan hadn't brought the grain out of charity, and he hadn't asked for the marriage to secure a bloodline. He had demanded the ancient severing rite on purpose. He knew their traditions. He knew that physically cutting a true mate bond sends both wolves into a state of severe physiological shock. It lowers the heart rate, causes dizziness, and drastically dulls the reflexes for hours. He had timed his coup perfectly. He wanted Kaelin weakened, reeling from the spiritual amputation of losing his Luna. He wanted the northern pack confused and demoralized, gathered without their armor in a closed room. He intended to wipe out the royal line tonight, blame it on a tragic rebellion, and seize the territory and its vital mountain passes by dawn. But he had miscalculated. Southerners viewed mating bonds as political contracts easily broken and rearranged. He didn't understand the feral, uncompromising nature of a northern bond. He didn't anticipate that Kaelin would choose the madness of keeping her over the logic of a crown. Kaelin wasn't in shock. He was enraged. "Kaelin," she said, keeping her voice utterly devoid of emotion. She stepped up beside him, pressing her shoulder against his arm. She didn't whisper. Whispering implies fear, but she spoke low enough that only he could hear the words beneath the din of the room. "The doors are barred. They took down Garrett and Jorn. The blades are weeping wolf's bane." She felt the muscles in his arm turn to absolute granite. He didn't look back at the doors. A predator never takes his eyes off the primary threat. "How many?" Kaelin asked, his voice a low hum vibrating through her shoulder. 40 swordsmen inside the hall. She calculated rapidly, her eyes darting across the room. Maybe 20 more outside securing the courtyard. Harlan's captain is the linchpin. If he falls, the nobles will panic and break formation. "Hold the dais," Kaelin ordered. It wasn't a request. It was the command of a general on a battlefield. He finally let go of her uninjured hand. She immediately reached down and grabbed the stiff, silver-embroidered velvet of her heavy skirt. With a vicious, unladylike yank, she tore the fabric straight up the side seam, exposing her leg up to the mid-thigh. She needed to be able to move. She needed to be able to kick. Dignity was a luxury for peacetime. Harlan was still monologuing, blind to the shift in their demeanor. "Lay down your arms," the southern lord shouted to the northern wolves who were growing increasingly agitated by the barred doors. "Submit to the southern ridges, and I will allow you access to the grain. Defend this mad king, and you will all die in this frozen tomb." "You talk too much, Harlan," Kaelin said. The Alpha King didn't draw a sword. He didn't reach for a dagger. He simply reached up with both hands, unfastened the heavy iron clasps at his collar, and let the massive black bear pelt drop from his shoulders to the floor with a heavy thud. Underneath, he wore only a thin linen shirt, tight across the broad expanse of his chest and shoulders. He rolled his neck, a sickening crack, echoing over the murmurs of the crowd. "Kill him!" Harlan shrieked suddenly, realizing that the trap had lost its element of surprise. "Captain, take his head." The whip-thin captain lunged forward, raising his longsword, the blade glistening with the dark, oily sheen of the poison. He was fast-moving, with the practiced grace of a master duelist. But a duelist fights by rules. A wolf fights for blood. Kaelin didn't step back to avoid the strike. He stepped into it. As the poisoned blade swung down in a lethal arc aimed at his neck, Kaelin shifted his weight, letting the blade slice through the linen shirt and bite a shallow, bloody line across his bicep. The captain's eyes widened in momentary shock at the suicidal maneuver. That fraction of a second was all Kalen needed. Ignoring the burning sting of the wolfsbane entering his system, Kalen's hand shot out his fingers, closing around the captain's throat with the crushing force of a steel vice. He lifted the man entirely off his feet, stopping the captain's momentum dead in its tracks. The room went deathly silent save for the sickening wet sound of Kalen squeezing. "My mate." Kalen snarled, his black eyes fixed on the gasping captain, but his words meant for Harlan is a better tactician than you. She smelled your rot from 30 paces. With a brutal, effortless twist of his wrist, Kalen snapped the captain's neck. He dropped the lifeless body onto the wooden steps of the dais, the poisoned sword clattering harmlessly to the floor. Kalen turned his black eyes toward Lord Harlan, the blood from his arm dripping steadily onto the ancient wood. "Now," the Alpha King whispered, the sound carrying absolute doom. "Let's renegotiate the price of grain." Panic smelled like sour copper and voided bowels. For a fraction of a second, the Southern Guards simply stared at their captain's broken body resting on the ceremonial steps. Their brains trained for orderly formations, and battlefield chivalry couldn't process the sheer brutal efficiency of a wolf defending his mate. Then survival instincts overrode their discipline. 40 swords raised in unison, the candlelight catching the oily smear of wolfsbane on the steel. Harlan scrambled backward, his velvet cloak catching under his heel, sending him sprawling hard onto the stone floor. "Kill them," he shrieked, his voice cracking into a high, undignified register. "Slaughter every last animal in this room." Saoirse didn't wait for them to charge. Her bare left leg flashed from the slit in her heavy velvet skirt as she dropped to a crouch. She grabbed the hilt of the captain's discarded long sword. It was a southern blade, too light for her liking, balanced for thrusting, rather than the heavy chopping strokes she was used to. The leather grip was still warm from the dead man's hand. A guard in polished breastplate lunged at her, aiming a sweeping cut at her waist. She brought the sword up, blocking the strike. The impact sent a jarring, agonizing vibration straight down her arm, rattling her teeth. Her corset, laced far too tight by poor, terrified Anna, dug fiercely into her bruised ribs, stealing her breath. She couldn't fight a prolonged duel. She didn't have the stamina, the armor, or the oxygen. Instead of parrying his neck strike, she stepped inside his guard. She let go of her sword with her left hand, driving her bleeding palm upward, slamming the heel of her hand directly under his chin. Bone crunched. He staggered back, choking, and she buried the poisoned southern blade straight into the gap between his breastplate and his thigh guard. He went down screaming. She wrenched the blade free. Beside her, Kalen was a nightmare, rendered in flesh and bone. He had no weapon, relying entirely on the devastating raw power of his half-shifted state. His fingernails had elongated into thick black talons. A guard swung a halberd at his head. Kalen caught the wooden shaft in his bare hand, the wood splintering under his grip. He yanked the weapon forward, throwing the guard off balance, and drove his knee into the man's chest with the sound of a collapsing roof. But the poison was already working. She saw it in the slight drag of Kalen's right foot. She saw it in the thick, unnatural sweat dripping from his brow, matting his dark hair to his forehead. Wolfsbane doesn't just numb, it burns. It sets the nervous system on fire while simultaneously paralyzing the muscles. The shallow cut on his bicep was oozing a sluggish blackish blood. "Behind you!" she screamed, her voice raw. A swordsman had circled the dais, rushing at Kaelin's blind spot. She threw herself forward, her heavy velvet train wrapping around her ankles. She stumbled, going down hard on one knee, the stone bruising her kneecap through the fabric. From the ground, she swung her blade in a desperate, wide arc. The steel bit deeply into the back of the swordsman's knees. He collapsed with a wet shriek, his poisoned blade clattering inches from Kaelin's boot. The great hall had devolved into a meat grinder. Their people, the Northerners, couldn't shift. The tight quarters and the presence of the poison made a full transformation. A death sentence, a large, furry target, was easier to hit with a toxic blade than a smaller human one. But they were starving, angry, and defending their home. They fought with whatever they had. Fists' teeth scavenged daggers, heavy iron candlesticks torn from the walls. She saw old Bran the Elder, who had just administered the severing rite, plunge his ceremonial obsidian knife into the eye socket of a heavily armored southerner. Bran's white robes were soaked in crimson, his ancient face set in a grim, terrifying rictus. The smell was atrocious. Wet wool spilled ale from overturned tables, the sharp ozone tang of adrenaline, and the metallic cloying stench of fresh blood pooling on the flagstones. It was slippery. She lost her footing twice, sliding in the gore of men she had invited into her home just hours before. Kaelin roared a sound that was more beast than man, and threw a massive guard bodily off the dais, crashing him into a heavy oak table that splintered upon impact. But Kaelin stumbled backward, his chest heaving, his right arm hanging, unnaturally heavy at his side. The veins in his neck were standing out, pulsing with dark, poisoned blood. He was slowing down. She scrambled to her feet, her chest burning for air against the unyielding whalebone of her corset. She backed up until her spine hit Kaelin's broad back. They stood back to back on the wooden dais, a dying king and his discarded Luna, surrounded by a ring of desperate, heavily armed men. "You look terrible," she gasped, her chest heaving against his back. She kept her sword raised, her hands shaking slightly from muscle fatigue. "You ruined your dress." Kaelin rasped, his voice thick and slurred. She felt a violent tremor rack his massive frame. He was fighting the paralysis with pure, stubborn willpower. "It was ugly anyway," she said, wiping a smear of someone else's blood from her forehead with the back of her wrist. 5 southern guards circled them, their swords raised. They looked terrified, but they knew Kaelin was fading. They just had to wait him out. "When I drop," Kaelin whispered the words, vibrating through her spine. "Take the blade. Go to the upper parapet. Do not let them take you alive, Saoirse." Rage, hot and white, flared in her chest. Not at the Southerners, but at him. "Shut up," she hissed fiercely. "I didn't cut my hand open just to watch you die on the floor. You are not dropping." Before the guards could close the circle, a deafening crash shook the hall. The heavy iron bar on the main double doors, the one the Southerners had dropped into place, groaned violently. Someone was hitting the doors from the outside. Not a man, a battering ram. Crash! The thick oak splintered. The iron bar bowed inward. Crash! With a sound like thunder, the massive doors blew completely off their hinges, crashing down into the hall and crushing 2 Southern guards beneath thousands of pounds of wood and iron. Through the dust and the flying splinters strode a massive, scarred grey wolf. It was the size of a war horse, its fur matted with snow and dried blood. It let out a roar that shook the wax from the chandeliers. It was Garrett. He had survived the stab wound, dragged himself to the courtyard, and let the beast take completely over. And he hadn't come alone. Pouring in behind him were 50 of their border patrol. They hadn't been invited to the ceremony. They were the rough, feral wolves who guarded the mountain passes, men and women who lived in the snow and ate their meat raw. They surged into the great hall like an avalanche of fur muscle and snapping teeth. The southern discipline completely broke. The guards dropped their poisoned swords and tried to run. There was nowhere to go. The border wolves didn't bother with weapons. They hit the southern lines with the force of a freight train, dragging armored men to the ground, crushing breastplates, with their jaws tearing through leather and flesh with terrifying ease. The battle was over in less than 3 minutes. It wasn't a fight anymore. It was a culling. Silence returned to the great hall, but it was an ugly, heavy silence, broken only by the wet sounds of wolves feeding their rage, the groans of the dying, and the crackle of the torches. Saoirse dropped the stolen sword. It clattered against the blood-slicked floorboards. Her arms felt like they were filled with lead, her hands numb and cramping. The adrenaline was draining out of her system, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion. Behind her, Kalen finally gave out. He hit the floor like a felled oak, landing hard on his knees. His head dropped, his chin resting against his chest. His breathing was a harsh, rattling wheeze. She turned and dropped to her knees beside him. The corset bit into her ribs again, but she ignored it. She grabbed his face, forcing his head up. His skin was freezing, clammy with sweat. His eyes were open, but the pupils were completely blown, the grey iris swallowed by a hazy, unfocused black. Kalen, look at me. She commanded, her voice trembling for the first time that night. She slapped his cheek hard. Look at me. He blinked slowly. His gaze wandered aimlessly before finally snapping to her face. A weak, bloody smile touched the corner of his mouth. Still here, he rasped. Idiot. She choked out a dry sob, tearing itself from her throat. You absolute selfish idiot. You ruined the treaty. Treaty was a trap. He mumbled, his head rolling sideways against her shoulder. You didn't know that. When you stopped the ceremony, she yelled at him, hitting his chest with a weak, closed fist. You stopped it because you're stubborn, because you couldn't stand the smell of her. Couldn't stand the lack of you, he corrected sluggishly. His heavy, calloused hand came up, his trembling fingers tangling in the messy, unpinned strands of her dark hair. He pulled her forehead down to rest against his. His skin smelled of poison and sweat, but underneath it, the faint, comforting scent of pine and wood smoke still lingered. Inside her chest, the severed mating bond, the ragged, bleeding spiritual nerve she had cut, began to pulse. It hurt. It was a dull, burning ache, like a broken bone trying to set itself without a splint. But it was there. He was close enough, his intent clear enough, that the magic between them refused to die. Lord Kalen, Lady Saoirse. Bran's voice broke the moment. The elder stood at the bottom of the dais. He looked older than she had ever seen him, his white robes stained completely red, leaning heavily on a wooden staff. The hall is secure, Bran said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual ceremonial warmth. The southern captain is dead. The remaining guards have surrendered or been dealt with. We have secured the grain wagons in the courtyard." She pulled her head away from Kaelin, shifting her weight so she was supporting his slumped frame. She looked past Bran. In the center of the hall, kneeling in a pool of his own guard's blood, was Lord Harlan. He was sobbing loudly and pathetically, his hands clutching the ripped fabric of his velvet cloak. Beside him, untouched and shivering violently, sat Cecily. The beautiful ivory silk of her dress was splattered with mud and gore. She wasn't crying anymore. She was just staring at the wall, completely hollowed out by the violence she had witnessed. "Bring him up here," Kaelin growled. His voice was incredibly weak, but the alpha command still thrummed beneath the words. Two large border wolves grabbed Harlan by the armpits, dragging him roughly across the floor and dumping him at the bottom of the dais steps. The Southern Lord refused to look up, keeping his face buried in his shaking hands. "My lord," Harlan wept, his voice muffled. "Mercy, we were deceived. The captain acted on his own." "Lie to me again, Harlan," Kaelin said softly, struggling to keep his head upright, "and I will let Garrett eat your tongue." Harlan snapped his mouth shut, whimpering softly. "The grain in the courtyard," Kaelin said, every word a visible effort. "It belongs to the North now. Reparations for an attempted assassination on a ruling alpha." Harlan nodded frantically. "Yes, take it. Take it all. Just let us leave." Kaelin turned his heavy, half-lidded eyes toward her. He didn't say a word, but the question hung in the bloody air between them. What do they do with him, as Luna Saoirse had overseen justice in the pack for a decade? She looked at the sobbing man on the floor. She wanted to kill him. She wanted to take the obsidian knife and open his throat for what he had forced her to do to herself. But she looked at Cecily, the terrified, innocent girl who had been traded like cattle and used as bait. Killing Harlan meant war with the southern ridges. They had their food, but they didn't have the numbers for a sustained siege. "You will leave," she told Harlan, her voice ringing out clearly in the silent hall. She sat up straighter, adjusting the torn velvet of her ruined dress, reclaiming the space beside the king. "You will take your daughter. You will take your surviving men. You will leave your armor, your weapons, your horses, and your wagons." Harlan finally looked up, his face pale and tear-streaked. "On foot. The pass is freezing. It's a 3-week march to the border. Then you had better start walking," she said, her tone devoid of an ounce of sympathy. "If my border patrols catch your scent on our lands after the next full moon, they will not bother taking prisoners. Now get out of my sight." Harlan didn't argue. He scrambled to his feet, grabbed Cecily by the wrist, and half-dragged her toward the shattered main doors, surrounded by a heavy escort of growling northern wolves. The great hall slowly began to clear. Their people were hauling the bodies away, beginning the grueling task of cleaning the sanctuary. Saoirse stayed on the floor with Kaelin. The fire in the chandeliers was burning low, casting long, flickering shadows across the dais. Kaelin reached out again, ignoring his paralyzed right arm, and grabbed her left hand. The cut on her palm had stopped bleeding, but it was deep and ugly. He pulled her hand toward his face. Before she could pull away, he pressed his mouth to the wound. His tongue, rough and hot, dragged across the broken skin. It wasn't a kiss. It was an ancient primal gesture. A wolf cleaning the wounds of its mate. A physical, desperate attempt to stitch the frayed edges of their severed bond back together through shared blood and saliva. She closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the heavy wooden altar. The pain in her chest flared intensely for a moment, then slowly began to recede, replaced by a deep, humming warmth that settled into her bones. "We are still starving," she whispered to the empty ceiling. "The grain will only last until the spring thaw. We still have no air. You solved nothing tonight, Kaelin." He lowered her hand, resting his cheek against her knee. He was fading fast, the exhaustion and the poison finally pulling him under into a healing sleep. "I kept you." He mumbled, his eyes closing completely. The tension finally left his massive shoulders. "I'll figure the rest out tomorrow." She looked down at his sleeping face, smeared with dirt and poison and blood. She ran her fingers through his dark, tangled hair. He was right. Tomorrow, they would have to ration the stolen grain. Tomorrow, they would have to prepare for the inevitable southern retaliation. Tomorrow, the cold would still be here. But as she sat on the blood-soaked dais, listening to the steady, reassuring thud of Kaelin's heart, she realized something. She had yielded the space. She had stepped aside. But this pack, this freezing, brutal, beautiful winter wasteland, didn't want a perfect vessel. It wanted a survivor. She shifted her weight, making herself comfortable on the hard stone, ready to watch over him until the sun came up. Are you tired of predictable heroines and clean fairy tales? If you felt the chill of the northern wind and the bite of the wolf in this story, don't let the journey end here. Hit that like button, share this video with fellow fantasy romance lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more dark, grounded, and emotionally raw storytelling. The pack is waiting for you. Join us.